He's like a butterfly flapping his wings deep down into the forest, man. It's gonna cause a tree fall like 5,000 miles away, man. There ain't nobody seeing nobody. Man, it seems like you don't even know, man. It's like you're born into this world, man. And you got like the dust of wind, man. Or like a dang old candle wind, man. It don't matter, man. It's all the time.
All right, we are live with George Bagby again. I'm really happy to have you on, Bagby.
I'm thrilled to be back. Thanks so much for having me.
Definitely. Obviously, you're a busy man, and I'm busy, so it's difficult to make this work. But I'm always really enjoy our conversations. We've been doing sort of an informal series on the different populations that were important to the early history of America, right? The people who settled these United States. And so I want to just jump straight into that. Do you want to introduce the group we're talking about tonight?
Yes. Yes, I've been interested in these original streams of Anglo settlements on the East Coast, the initial population of the original 13 states. And I've been deep in that literature for a very long time. Tonight we're going to be talking about the Cavaliers and the settlement of colonial Virginia. So I'll start out with a quote from Daniel Boorstin, who wrote several books in a series about the United States. And I forget what these books won. I think that they won some awards back in the day. This particular one, The Colonial Experience, it was published in 1958. Daniel Boorstin says, Virginia is a different story. Here we see no grandiose scheme, no attempt to rule by an idea, but an earthy effort to transplant institutions. If other colonies sought escape from English vices, Virginians wished to fulfill English virtues. Let other colonies dazzle the world with a city upon a hill, inspired by a commonwealth of brotherly love, or encouraged with a vast humanitarian experiment. The model in Virginians' heads was compounded by the actual features of a going community, the England, especially the rural England of the 17th and 18th century. So Boorstin gives us this very durable image of the transplanted civilization. The settlers of colonial Virginia liked where they came from. They liked the institutions of 17th century England, and they sought conscientiously to transplant them in the New World. And that is part of the story here. Obviously, it's not the same animal, but one of the aspects of the story that adds some color to it to me, the colonial Virginians, they loved hunting with hounds for foxes, just as their forebears did, their aristocratic forebears back in the old country. And so they deliberately brought over red foxes and the hound dogs, of course, that they were accustomed to using. They brought them over as well, but they deliberately trapped red foxes back in England, and they brought them to Virginia so that they could recreate the kind of sport that they were used to back in the old world. That's just a lovely little picture of how much they wanted to recreate the England and the institutions that they loved and the practices that they loved from the old world in the new world.
It's interesting because you see that even in places like Williamsburg, right? With some of it's a reconstruction, some of it's original, right? But it looks exactly like England, right? The way the town is set up, the architecture, even down to the governor's mansion, which again I believe is reconstructed, right? But
Yes.
Everything is built or was built when it was original, right, in conscious imitation of England, right? So, for instance, and I forgive me if I don't remember the exact term for this, but you know, in the governor's mansion, there are extremely elaborate art displays made of muskets and sabers and bayonets, right? Which was all the rage in England at the time, right, as a symbol of kind of
Yes.
imperial power, and that was a very deliberate decision, right, to tie themselves to the crown.
And even a symbol of sovereignty, like to display literal arms on the wall, to have swords crossed on the wall, or spears crossed on the wall, or muskets crossed on the wall, um, was a symbolic image of sovereignty, right? This is what a free man, a nobleman of old Europe, or a king of old Europe would display. But in America, it was so common to run into a freeman, someone who had no obligation to another man, lived on his own land that he had outright, who owned arms. Is extremely common in America, and this is a universal trait. This is something that's common even in Quaker land, because the Quakers themselves were a minority in Quaker land, where people were armed, and that was a sign of sovereignty. And that's a really good American symbol that still endures, and the Europeans don't quite know what to do with it. Well, what's up with all these Americans? Why are they so particular about their guns and all that? It's because this is actually something very old that the Europeans used to appreciate, that a nobleman, a sovereign, uh, of a sort, they would own weapons. And this was something that used to be represented in the heraldic arms, right? We even preserve that term, the arms, when it comes to the symbol, the heraldic symbols of a gentry family, right? If you had a fiefdom, you were gentry, and you had a hereditary coat of arms. And the coat of arms is like your symbol that you owned weapons. And we preserve that name, the arms, um, related to the heraldic symbols, which is kind of funny, but it's something connected with that old feudal mode where most people wouldn't own arms, right? Most people were serfs, and the best they had as far as arms were pitchforks and shovels and things like that. But a gentleman owned arms. But in America, in particularly in Virginia, there were quite a few uh, aspirational gentlemen, and a great many gentlemen that actually had the rights from the old world. So that was a common feature in colonial Virginia. There were an awful lot of gentry that came over from England, and they brought their coats of arms with them, and obviously their arms, though those were more interchangeable, much more common in a more industrial time to have arms. Um, it wasn't a prohibitive luxury. But they came over in large numbers, partly because of the English Civil War. So they were the distressed Cavaliers. They were the losers of the English Civil War, and they came over here in large numbers. I have another couple quotes here to share. These are both from David Hackett Fisher and his Mammoth Albion's Seed, which is a marvelous resource, one of the best books about America that you could pick up. But these are his epigraphs for his chapter on Virginia. He says, or he quotes Ingram's proceedings from 1676, and Ingram had it: Virginia was the only place of refuge left in His Majesty's dominions in those times for distressed Cavaliers. So those were the losers of the English Civil War, who were the nobility of Old England that had supported King Charles. Secondly is from Durand of Dauphin. He's writing in 1687, and he says of Virginia, "The gentlemen called Cavaliers are greatly esteemed and respected, and are very courteous and honorable. They hold most of the offices in the colony." So just as examples, this was the character of Virginia. They not only really liked medieval England in particular, but they were the losers of a civil war and kind of forgive me. They ended up in the New World rather by a happenstance of history. They happened to be on the losing side in their effort to sustain their institutions back in their own old country, and they came in large numbers to Virginia.
So we've already mentioned the English Civil War, and obviously the, shall we say, the predominant media myth of the founding of America has to do with the Pilgrims. So obviously, I'm not asking you to go into this fully, but one, who are the, shall we say, the original Anglo colonists, the U.S.? What group do they represent, and what side did those people fight on during the English Civil War?
So there's obviously a big conflict between those two founding stories. We have two that have been in conflict in our public memory for a long time, and that is the arrival of the Pilgrim Fathers on the Mayflower in Massachusetts, and we have the arrival of the first Virginian settlers at the Jamestown colony in 1607. And that is actually the older of the two. The Virginia colony is the older settlement. But the Virginia colony doesn't start out really as a settlement. All of the first occupants of Jamestown are male. They are all adventurers. They are there to find exploitable resources. So this would be analogous in our age to a mission to mine an asteroid or something like that. This is not dreamed up as a permanent place of residence for anyone involved. Most of these people imagine that they are going to find gold, or they're going to find pearls or something like that, or they're going to quickly grow copious amounts of silk and take it back home and be very rich and famous for going to the New World and striking it rich. The people that landed in Plymouth, Massachusetts, came with their families and young children, and they intended to stay permanently. And they also came at a very unadvisable time. You know, they arrive in November, right at the very beginning of winter. But the Virginians, they take the form of a permanent settlement after John Rolfe arrives on the Sea Venture, or he is one of the castaways of the Sea Venture. It wrecks in Bermuda on the way to Virginia, and he arrives, marries Pocahontas very famously, secures a peace with the Indians, and plants tobacco that he had brought from the Caribbean, where it had been grown successfully. He brought a variety of tobacco, a hybrid, to Virginia, cultivated it successfully, and sent the first tobacco back to the Old World, and made incredible profits, and made tobacco the staple crop, the cash crop of Virginia. So that sparked permanent interest in Virginia, and lots of people started coming. Before then, the vast majority of the people that had come to Virginia had died without leaving an issue. So most of them died without ever having children here. But after John Rolfe, the colony flourishes and becomes extremely wealthy, and very desirable. But it's always in contrast with Massachusetts. Massachusetts always has a more industrial trading bent, mercantile sort of bent, um, partly because the land just isn't very good for growing things. So they went to the sea in ships and traded things instead. They started building ships extremely early up there. They lived close together in Massachusetts. That's something that I still notice when I'm up in that part of the country. It has a far more urban sort of character to it. Down in Virginia, everyone always lived far apart from each other, and that is still more the rule in the South, though we've been very urbanized more recently. In the South, people like living on space. They like living with land between them and land to live on and do things with. It has always had a more rustic character. The South has always been more agricultural in its focus, and agriculture has always had a far more dominant role in the South up until just recently. But the North has always been much more urban and centered around big ports and various industries and merchant activities. Of course, there is also the big religious difference, which manifests itself in a major difference in attitude. Might be helpful to think of that as an attitude difference. The North was, well, let's say Massachusetts was founded by religious radicals, by Protestant extremists, you might say. So dynamic in their convictions that the sect early ceased to exist. It was just so dynamic; it didn't have much staying power, and it was too it was too unstable. They were interested in rejecting various parts of their heritage. They had an analytical spirit, which they applied to most every aspect of their heritage to get rid of things they deemed spiritually contaminated with Catholicism. Ultimately, they were fanatically anti-Catholic. The Virginians, even though they are Protestant, they are Anglicans. The Church of England is the established church in Virginia. They are still very interested in their heritage and interested in affirming things in their heritage. And this is a really striking difference between the two colonies. Historically, in American history, many historians have played up this difference between New England collectively and Virginia or the Virginian elites because they played such disproportionate roles in American history. They're two different ways in colonial America and up until the Civil War. And the terms used to describe them were the Puritans and the Cavaliers, which is very telling because those are the two sides of the English Civil War. So it's a trope among American historians. It's still something that historians will bring up today, though it's not as popular of a trope today. The idea that American history is partly defined and explained as a continuation of differences, tensions, and finally violent conflict between two lead actors in English conflict, in English tensions, back in English history, in the history of England up until the English Civil War. So the colony of Virginia is partly, well, it's seriously impressed with the career of Governor William Berkeley, who was a big supporter of King Charles being the royal governor of Virginia generally meant that you were good friends with the king. The king appoints these men directly. They serve at the king's pleasure, and they frequently serve for the rest of their natural lives. King Charles I had appointed William Berkeley to Virginia. He had been knighted by King Charles and came to Virginia, and then tried to support the king in his struggle with Parliament and the Puritans. He condemned the king's executioners when the Rump Parliament executed Charles I. He called them regicides and even parricides. So that's more than homicide, right? There's a hierarchical distinction that's built into the term. Patricide, father killer, as opposed to homicide, man killer, right? To be a father killer is far worse because you have an obligation to your father that you do not have to mankind generally. And regicide, of course, is a hierarchical thing to be a killer of kings. At the exact same time King Charles has been executed, the Puritans of Massachusetts are celebrating. This is really interesting that there's this radical difference in attitude between the two places, and this goes back to the mid 16th or the mid 17th century, mid 1600s. William Berkeley, Governor Berkeley, deliberately recruits Cavaliers who have been dispossessed, kicked out of their lands. Very interesting. One of these Cavaliers that comes over during Berkeley's administration is John Washington, who is the grandfather of George Washington. John Washington was an Anglican clergyman who had been removed from his parish with violence by the conquering Puritans. He was not in agreement with the Puritan doctrine, and so he had to remove himself to Virginia, where his family made a name for themselves. These Cavaliers, according to David Hackett Fisher, these patricians that had immigrated during Governor Berkeley's tenure as governor, of those whose political opinions were known, 98% of them identified with the royalist cause in the English Civil War. So this is just an overwhelming sort of attitude that's dominating the time and place. And these people impress their character on colonial Virginia. We can see a lot of this in the place names. We see lots of royalist place names in Tidewater, Virginia, that were all named after or named by these people after their heroes, after the people that they loved. King and Queen County, Prince George County, Princess Anne County, King William County, James City, Charles City, Elizabeth City. All of these are named after royal figures in England. They're all hearkening back to royalist heroes and leaders. And so Virginia is early impressed with this medieval hierarchical social system, with this special group of elites who have been dispossessed and exiled. And so they bring with them a particular nostalgia for their lost country and their folkways, which are under assault by the Puritans, who are their old enemies. They have differences with these people, obviously. They just lost a civil war to them back in the old world. And they stamp this impression of medievalism on their territory in the New World. Another characteristic, forgive me, I've got something wrong. I keep coughing, and I'm sorry.
Oh, no worries.
there are this group that come over during the English Civil War, but there are an awful lot of second sons that transplant their families over into Virginia. And these are the victims of primogeniture back in the old world. So the way this works is land was tied to the firstborn son in the old English law system. And this has an efficient factor to it. It has a very practical concern behind it. And that is, if you forever split up the family land between all of the children, or even just all of the sons, in only a couple generations, the plots are too small to farm and support a family on anymore.
Just an
You just
interesting detail that has actually become more relevant due to kind of certain recent developments in American migration patterns. Actually, this is what happened in Haiti after the revolution. Is that there
yeah,
was a decree that all land, which obviously had been seized from its owners, had to be divided equally among all descendants. And so very quickly it became absolutely impossible to have any sort of productive agriculture whatsoever. And when you look at the difference between a place like Haiti and the Dominican Republic, right, which share the same island, uh, obviously there are other factors at work, but that's certainly one of them. But sorry, Bagby, back to you.
no, that is a very important point. Um, th- this uh, this comes up in several interesting places, and we can take this idea far afield. This happened in Egypt. Egypt used to be the incredibly productive agricultural machine of the Mediterranean, and they did that for since ancient times. They were exporting food, but all it took was President Nasser, I believe, who instituted land reform and split all of the property between all of the male children, and in one generation, Egypt became a food importer because so many people started living on small plots of land and they could no longer efficiently farm them because all the land had been split up between the population like that. So it divided the agricultural holdings and it cut the agricultural production dramatically. So primogeniture was the way of life back in Old England, but it meant that the younger sons needed to find something else to do. So a farmer or a farming family, the oldest son would apprentice to take over the farm. He is going to be the new head of the household, and his father will retire, and he will take care of his father there on the land. They'll have a multi-generational household, but the younger sons need to find something else to do. So there was a tradition that one of the younger sons would go into the ministry. He'd become a priest, uh, or in older times he might become a monk. Another son would go into the army. Another son might go into the professions. But in colonial days, a second son could go to Virginia and apply for a title to a land holding, and he could be a farmer in Virginia. Now, this was very attractive to a great many agriculturally minded people who were also royalists and also concentrated in the south of England. That's another thing about these Cavaliers. They they were predominantly coming from the south side of England, from the countryside around Bristol and around London in particular. And they come in large numbers and they want to live in an agricultural community. They want to farm, and they love the new world in the southern colonies of America because there is an awful lot of good agricultural land. They can spread out. They can have big families and make sure that their sons all have plots of land going forward so that they can continue this farming life. So this is the way of life they prefer. They want to be farmers. And they do not settle in dense towns and cities. That this is not their pattern in the southern states. There are only a couple of exceptions to this. Charleston, South Carolina, is a really fascinating example of this uh, very tight little urban center in an overwhelmingly agricultural state, but still has a small population, even though these people are tightly settled in little colonial Charleston. The other example, of course, being New Orleans, but New Orleans is just so exceptional in so many ways. It's not a good example of a southern city. It's kind of its own thing. But most Southerners don't live in cities up until the time of the Civil War. They're overwhelmingly concentrated in the countryside. One historian of colonial Virginia, Alden Hatch, who wrote a book called The Birds of Virginia, and that is the family, the bird family, not birds as in the fowl. But he said, why should Virginians huddle in towns? Every large plantation was a self-sustaining unit, which raised its own food and had a carpenter, mason, butcher, baker, candle maker, and blacksmith, and its own wharf on the deep water from which produce could be easily shipped directly to England. So this is a good example of how Virginian life developed after the Cavaliers come over and transplant their farming ways in the tidewater of Virginia. They build their manor houses, and they develop what Richard Weaver called a unique strain of American individualism. We may know something about the New England strain, well represented by people like Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson. But the Virginia strain or the Southern strain we can speak more generally, the Southern strain of individualism is a small community rooted in tradition, whereas the Northern strain of individualism is more like Thoreau on Walden Pond, kind of independently analyzing and evaluating the whole of the human experience and deciding what must stay and what must go. The Puritan reduced to an individual judging all of history, a way that should be familiar enough to us, I think. That kind of, if I may say, antisocial individualism. The Virginia individualism is distinctly different in so many ways. It is patriarchal, it is traditional, it is traditionally religious, to make another note on that, and it is social. We think of an individualist as someone living out by themselves. That was not the pattern of Virginia individualism. Virginia individualism is a small community on an estate. And this proved to be a very important model for the training of American leadership. The Southern plantation and the way of the Southern aristocrat, the development of the Southern aristocrat, was particularly important in the development of American politics and American military traditions. The Southern patriarch was analogous to the medieval lord. On his estate, he was the authority. He owed his people, be they indentured English people who had been spirited away to be forced into indentured servitude, or perhaps they were sold by their own families into indentured servitude, a kind of temporary slavery, if you will. All of that happened. You had people volunteering for indentured servitude. to have a chance to get to America and start over. You had people who were literally kidnapped into it. You had people who sold their own family members, even husbands who sold their own wives into the indentured servitude in Virginia. And of course, you had the African slaves, which formed their own unique class. But at the top of all of that social hierarchy was the Virginia planter, and he was the master of his estate. And if there was anything that went wrong on the estate, you know, two people are involved in an argument that leads to assault. The whole thing ends up in his lap. He is the judge. He is ultimately in charge of any punishment. So the Virginia elites, those that are involved as planters, who have indentured servants and or slaves, they have direct hands-on experience of what it takes to administer justice to a village of people, some of whom may be like themselves. The indentured servants predominantly come from the same regions of England as do the elites in colonial Virginia. And sometimes they are dealing with people who may not even speak their language, right? The African slaves who have a radically different origin, different religion, different customs, they still have to administer justice to all of them. They are responsible for their people just as a medieval lord is responsible for his serfs. And this is how they explain themselves. This is how they justify their role and behavior. There is a wonderful book by Eugene Genovese, and it's called The Mind of the Master Class. And it is an examination of the thought, the self-explanation, the self-description of antebellum slave owners in particular, the antebellum Southern elite. They thought of themselves as the heirs of the medieval world. They defended their way of life the same way a medieval count might justify himself, if you could imagine one called to do so. They drew, and David Hackett Fisher actually talks a bit about this. They drew on writers like Robert Filmer, who wrote the retort. Well, he wrote it was John Locke that wrote a retort to Filmer, but Filmer wrote a book called The Patriarcha, and the Patriarcha is a justification of patriarchy, specifically an argument for monarchy. But the idea is that people have long-standing hierarchical arrangements that are natural. It's all built on the rightness and justice of a child obeying his father. It's a natural relationship. It's an unchosen relationship. And this is the way that the planters, the slave owners of the Old South, generally justified their relationship to their slaves. This was something that they had all grown up in. This was something the vast majority of them did not choose. Obviously enough with the slaves born into slavery, but this was the case with the owners as well. The vast majority of them were born into that relation with their slaves. They grew up with their slaves on the same plantation. They had known these people their entire lives. And normally this was something that they would live out the rest of their lives in the same place together in that same relation. But I'm getting far afield on that. They thought of themselves as heirs of the medieval world. Part of this gets expressed in their tradition of manners, which is something that even back in colonial days is remarked upon by many a traveler that the Virginians are very interested. Pardon me. The Virginians are very interested in good manners. They're very interested in social relations. They're interested in social hierarchy. They write about these things. They're very interested in honor, which is to say, maintaining one's status in the community, winning greater status in the community. Honor is something we encounter way back in Homer's poems. One way of understanding honor is what other people say about you, and you want them to say good things about you. George Washington left us a really delightful account of Virginia manners. It was published later on, partly because we venerate George Washington. We like George Washington. George Washington's rules of conduct, his book of manners, have these as a sampling. And you might recognize them. Many of these are very classical. Many of them are biblical. They're very traditional. And notice how very hierarchical they are. So, George Washington's manners. 1, fear God. 2, honor the king. 3, reverence thy parents. 4, submit to thy superiors. 5, despise not thy inferiors. 6, be courteous to the equals. Just as examples, there are a great many of these.
So it's interesting, and forgive me, I just want to break in for a little bit because, look, like there's certainly something to be learned from, the French post-structuralists, right? The scary postmoderns that, people like James Lindsay are always telling us about. But obviously they are wrong. And I think one of the things that they're, completely wrapped around the axle about is that idea of hierarchy, right? Because within that set of manners, right, there is a complete and total appreciation for and respect for hierarchy, right? The first one obviously has to do with God, then the king, then how you order yourself to people who are higher and lower than you. It's a much more human way of viewing the world than, we're all equal, and if we're not equal, it must be this sort of just grinding tyranny.
Absolutely. This is a very traditional, organic approach to society, to the collection of human beings. The Virginian is very interested in who is higher, who is lower, who has an obligation to whom, and even in changing that status. Now that is a very American sort of innovation and influence on these matters of social hierarchy. And this is perhaps one of those things we come to call the American dream, something that has so many definitions. It's not an entirely useful thing to talk about, but nevertheless, it's something that overshadows so many of our conversations about America. Why is it that people have so many hopes about America? Why is America different? Well, part of that was the idea that in America, you may be low born, like Alexander Hamilton, for instance, and yet you can make something of yourself here. If you have a talent, if you have some ability, if you have some industry, you can rise on the social hierarchy. Now, that's a really interesting idea because if making something of yourself, of a chance to be a success, if that is a thing in America, then hierarchy is an essential aspect. Because how can you make something of yourself without knowing the difference between something and something inferior, right? There is a difference in rank that's built into the idea itself. So we might say that Americans are all very interested in equality and things like that, or some kind of theoretical level playing field, or equal opportunity. But essentially, built into it is that idea of hierarchy, and that is something that really stands out if you want to go and browse Washington's manners, his list of manners that he memorized and could recite and such, and he wrote them down in his private papers. You notice that noticing rank is a really big deal. And they have their equals, they have their superiors, and they have their inferiors. Now, this is how families work. This is so very organic. Um, and maybe we're more aware of this if we come from larger families. I come from a larger family myself, and I was the oldest son, which is a blessing and a burden. Um, in a large family, you're aware that the older brother has a different place than the younger brother. That the older brother has certain responsibilities, certain things that the parents expect of him, that they won't expect of the younger siblings, right? And this is in spite of all of our legal reforms to get rid of primogeniture, for instance, the idea that the oldest son inherits the family estate. We still understand that older brother has special obligations, especially to the younger brother, and these are organic connections. These are unchosen connections, and this is the substance of what the Virginians and Filmer understood as patriarchy, the rule of the father, the rule of rank in a family, and the responsibility, the essential responsibility that comes with that. And this is the idea, ultimately, the Virginia planter cultivated a real idea of noblesse oblige, which was a common thing in the American experience until very recently. I mean, we still look for things like this whenever we find Mark Zuckerberg making a huge outlay to charity. He's going to reform the schools in New Jersey or something, and he's going to give this huge this glob of money for the purpose and set up some kind of bureaucracy. We're still seeing noblesse oblige even in that. We used to have so much more of it. We had people like Andrew Carnegie that built libraries, beautiful libraries all over the country. That was a sense of noblesse oblige. We had people like the Rockefeller family, which developed Acadia National Park and gave it to the federal government as a developed natural park full of beautiful gravel trails for horse riding and for walking. They purchased the land themselves. They developed it themselves, and then they put it aside as beneficence to the general public. That was a sense of noblesse oblige as well. It was something that was really manifested in these people's lives. They believed that they had means and that they owed something to the people that they lived with, their fellow citizens. On the Virginia plantation, this was manifested in the head of the household, the master of the manor, who is ruling over this fiefdom, a man like Andrew Jackson, a man like William Byrd back in colonial Virginia. William Byrd keeps diaries, very extensive diaries. We know a tremendous amount about his private thoughts and his private behavior. Some of it very scandalous in his journals that he left behind. And William Byrd says very interesting things in his diaries. He says that he is like one of the patriarchs of old with his manservants and his maidservants, with his flocks and his herds, with his various estates. He's comparing himself to Abraham. He's comparing himself to Solomon. He quotes Ecclesiastes in that context. And we don't have anyone in our society that we could make that would talk that way, that we could draw an analogy that way with, because the Virginia planter was responsible for the lives of other people, his indentured servants, and of course later on in American history, exclusively slaves. He was yet responsible for them. He was responsible for them, for his people, for his chattels, from life till death. He was responsible for their religious instruction. He was responsible for their baptism, their marriages. This is a really extraordinary thing, and we find this all over the literature, that the master of the manor was responsible for marrying the slaves, for finding mates for his slaves. And he wanted to accomplish that. Now, this is such a remarkable thing in our conception. Of course, we typically think of the slave owner as a ruthless tyrant in all respects. That was not the case. They run the gamut in behavior. There are good ones and bad ones, just like there are good business owners and bad business owners, good husbands and bad husbands, good fathers and bad fathers. But the rule of the model of behavior, what did people talk about as far as what this looked like when it was working? That in itself is scandalous today, the idea that it could work in any beneficial way. Nevertheless, that's what they believed, and that's how they talked about it. It could work. There were good masters. That's what they said. That's what they believed. We find Odysseus in the Odyssey praised by his slaves in Ithaca as a good master. And when Odysseus secretly returns to Ithaca in disguise because he's in danger of his life, that his estate has been taken over by traitors who are all trying to kill his son and woo his wife, and they're spoiling his riches and seducing his slave girls. He meets the swineherd, the noble swineherd, and asks the swineherd, who is in fact his slave, what manner of man is Odysseus, the master of Ithaca? And the swineherd says, oh, he was a good master. If he had been here longer, he would have found me a wife. And I am without a wife now, only because my master Odysseus has gone away and may be dead. If Odysseus was here, he would have found me a wife. Now that is such an extraordinary thing, because the swineherd, he turns out to be a noble thane of Odysseus, and he fights at Odysseus's side to clear the palace of the wicked suitors. But that is an example of the loyal slave. And remarkably, he expects the same thing from his master Odysseus back in the Bronze Age of Greece, as a slave in antebellum Mississippi would have expected of his master, that his master would find a wife suitable for him and marry them. The master of the manor would set up his people in housing. Now, this could be something very, very modest. Most slave owners only owned a few slaves. It was the very small minority that owned a large number, like 100, for instance. So the people that owned only a few slaves, who would live in a very small lodging with their slaves, They would live in very close quarters with one another, would typically do everything together, including working together. And we have a great many examples of this. Even Frederick Law Olmsted of New England, who traveled extensively in the South and wrote about what he saw while he was there in the 1850s. He describes slave owners working side by side with their slaves commonly. He sees this happen many times, yet he doesn't think that it's typical. He thinks that Southerners, as a rule, despise manual labor. But the great planters will set their slaves up in their own housing. They have to provide for them. They're meant to protect them. They are the judges over them. And this is the system that I initially started describing. This trained the greatest political leadership in the United States. This experience of being a planter on an estate, responsible for dozens of people, responsible for entire families of slaves, made capable executives. These were men accustomed to wielding power, accustomed to making judgments about the situations of other people, and accustomed to command. They could raise a militia like Andrew Jackson did and march overland with them. They had the capacity to call people up and command them into battle. This was the tradition of patriarchy. And it was the training of the great executives. And we can look at the record of the Virginia dynasty. Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Harrison, Tyler, Taylor, all of whom came from Virginia, and all of whom were slave owners. They were trained in this school of statesmanship, this school of military command. We see so many of them were successful military leaders, people like Jackson, people like Harrison, people like Taylor. They were accustomed to that executive role, and this also was a school for statesmanship. These people spoke very frankly about their debt to medieval Europe. They saw themselves as the heirs of medieval Europe. Now, this frequently makes people chuckle because they do not have serfs of their own ethnic stock. Obviously, they have slaves of a very different origin and heritage, and they are obviously a different kind of people. Nevertheless, they said, well, this is still at its best analogous to the medieval institution. And at its best, the Southerners said, it's something rooted. It's something that stays in one place for many generations, so that the slaves are not moved around. This medieval heritage was rooted on many appeals to the classics. George Washington loved Addison's play Cato, and he had this play performed at Valley Forge to encourage the soldiers. One line from Addison's Cato is, "Turn up thy eyes to Cato, there mayest thou see to what a godlike height the Roman virtues lift up mortal man." Washington also recorded in his commonplace book from Seneca, the Stoic philosopher. Seneca wrote, "An honest man can never be outdone in courtesy." Once again, George Washington meditating upon the importance of good manners. Seneca wrote, "A good man can never be miserable, nor a wicked man happy." something that a Platonist would find sympathy in. Of course, all of this manifests itself in ways we find both charming and controversial. Maybe the most charming aspect is the very formal relation of rank and sex in the tradition of dancing, which the Virginians excelled with and highly prized. They even brought over dancing instructors among their elites, both in Virginia and also in colonial Louisiana. Louisiana was very interested in dancing too, but kind of from a French and Spanish influence. The other very amusing ritual cultivated in the Old South was the ritual of dueling, which is all based in this tradition of honor and what people say about you. The duel is a delightful thing that is a very, very durable tradition. We still find this kind of tradition in the most prosaic of places, in a schoolyard or in a saloon, where one man or boy insults another, and then there's a back and forth. One decides how serious the matter will be, right? Does that man have a place to insult you? Are you taking that insult to heart? Are you going to count that as an insult, or will you laugh it off? In the schoolyard confrontation, it's remarkable how similar the ritual remains. In the schoolyard confrontation, one boy insults the other boy's mother, right? And then the first boy says, "No one insults my mother. I'll see you after class," right? And then everyone gathers around after class in the schoolyard or something, and they start throwing punches. And then the boy who was insulted, he punches the other boy's nose, and some red blood flows, and the other boy tears up. And the first boy, the affronted boy, says, "All right, then, you don't talk about my mother now." And the second boy says, "Okay, I won't. We're done." Right? And then they shake hands and walk away. This is more or less how the ritual of dueling works. The ritual of dueling it involves two people who are supposed to be social equals, and that's an important element. The man who throws the insult needs to have the same rank as the man receiving the insult in order for them to fight. If it's a waiter or a horse's groom who is throwing an insult at a gentleman, then he is mercilessly walloped for it, right? He's outside of his social rank, and he has no place to speak to a gentleman at all, and no one would recognize his place to do so. Like a waiter insulting someone at the table. We would still recognize that as absurd, right? Outrageous. And you don't fight a man under those circumstances. You dismiss a man under those circumstances, and we would still do that, right?
Well, it's the same thing as like if a homeless man is yelling at you on the street, you don't take it seriously.
Yes, entirely. And we still have these ranks. We think that we have liberated ourselves from social distinctions, and yet we still recognize social distinctions, and we still act according to them. So it would have to be a gentleman throwing an insult at another gentleman in order for it to develop into a duel. And then of course, some funny things are thrown in. The man who is challenged chooses the time, the place, and the weapon, which in an American context is almost exclusively pistols. That's why we say pistols at dawn. Americans like fighting with the latest thing. other Americans of other traditions, say Spanish Americans down in Louisiana or French Americans, they prefer fighting with foils, for instance, which they say is far more civilized. And I'm inclined to agree with them. I like the elegance of that. There's a lot of skill involved, and it's also not mortal. Typically, you can stab someone in the heart with a foil, but I'm fond of that means of dueling. We have many examples of that down here in Louisiana. But Americans typically fought with the pistols, and that was a far more mortal weapon to fight with. But it didn't mean that they would shoot to kill one another. There are a great many examples. Alexander Hamilton, for instance, John Randolph of Roanoke in Central Virginia, being another example when in a duel after walking the 10 paces and turning, they pointed their pistols up into the air and shot straight up. They never aimed at their opponents. But of course, we remember Aaron Burr turned and shot to kill Hamilton and did mortally wound him. He died a couple days later. So that was often enough thing. But that's a really interesting symbolic gesture of the duelist. This is a holdover from the medieval world, and it's you might relate it to the trial by ordeal, right? The idea that we will submit the matter to God or to fortune, and whoever is the offender, may he die. A couple other points, and I'll wrap up my thoughts here on colonial Virginia. The Virginians liked where they came from. This is the thing to remember. They liked old Virginia. They wanted to cultivate its heritage. They, like the Puritans, they typically named their places after places in Old England, places they had come from. They cultivated their Protestant English church, their Anglican tradition. So they brought over the Book of Common Prayer. And Governor Berkeley, in particular, had little patience for dissent. So dissenters were regulated and to some extent excluded. And of course, the English Civil War hastened that process. There were Puritans in colonial Virginia when the English Civil War began, but they were not there when it ended. The Quakers came through now and then, but they did not stay, and they were exiled from the colony very strictly. So it was a very Anglican colony. However, they were as serious in their Anglican convictions and practice as were the Puritans in their convictions. The English or the experience in colonial Virginia was very traditional in its approach to Anglicanism. The focus was not on the sermon. They did have sermons, but that was not the point of a service. The point of the service was the ceremony of the day. If it was a Sunday, it would be the Eucharistic service. It would be the divine liturgy. And there could be a homily in there, but that was not the point of it. The point was the ritual of the Eucharist. So there was a ceremony and a sacrament. Unlike the Puritans, the Virginians held on to their traditional church music, and they liked to sing in choirs. So this was something that they preserved from Old England and they cultivated in the New World. They built their churches with an altar in the center of things and with a pulpit off to the side. which was the typical approach. The focus of the service is not the preacher in his pulpit and his long and analytical sermon. It was the altar and the ceremony that takes place at the altar. That's the center of things. They baptized their children. They gave their children very regular expected English names. They named their son Robert and Edward and Edmund and all of that. They named their daughters, Mary and Elizabeth. The children were baptized at birth or soon after, obviously. There was a very important role of a godparent that typically lasted their life long. The godparent had a special role in custom to instruct the children in religion, to make sure that they understood their baptism, being that they were baptized when they were so very young. The idea is that the godparent had a responsibility to tell them all about it, to make sure that they understood about it. And of course, they were there at their baptism and they saw the whole ceremony, so they could explain something of it to them. One last feature of colonial Virginia is the food. We talked about Puritan food last time and how very spare it was. They didn't like using spices. They liked to eat cold beans. They had a great deal of wildlife, but did not take much interest in it. They famously have ducks and oysters and things like that. The Puritans were not hunting these things. They were not consuming these things. They had a very spare diet, and they wanted to exult in that. They wanted people to know, we don't need things. We can get by without that. It's needless. It is luxurious, and we are a very simple people. We're a very virtuous and plain people, and we do not need fancy things. The Virginians, in contrast, loved to dress up, loved to have formal gatherings, big feasts with ceremony, liked to dress up their church services with ceremonies and costume, liked to have parties and balls, and they liked to feast. And Fisher, David Hackett Fisher, says the Virginians were the only colonial Americans with a hot cuisine. They had a wonderful array of tasty foods. They liked them highly seasoned. They liked to fry. They liked to grill. They liked to roast. They loved a dish they called a fricassee. And a fricassee is a chicken that is roasted with a buttercream sauce and lots of herbs. Sounds really wonderful. It's a simple, rich, tasty sort of dish. But these prototypical Southerners also ate lots of what we would consider to be soul food. They loved fried chicken. They ate pork in incredible quantities. They're inventing roast pork with various sauces. They like sauces. They get this from the old world, and they do new things with them in the new world. They invent things that we would identify as barbecue sauce, and they roast pigs. They bring the pigs with them to the New World. The pigs are not indigenous to the New World. This is part of the Columbian exchange. And these European hogs take to the forests. Colonial Virginia is full of gigantic old growth oak forests that are deep, filled with acorns. Think of bushels and bushels of acorns under these ancient oak trees. Well, the hogs go into the oak forests and they gorge themselves on these acorns, and they become gigantic and fat. And the colonial Virginians go hunting for these hogs and roast these ridiculous swine, and they start eating pork in incredible quantities. So this is the origin of bacon and barbecue in the American tradition. And this is a remarkable thing to consider. European travelers come to America, and in particularly in the South, where the tradition of eating salt bacon all times of the year is ubiquitous. Everyone is eating quantities of bacon. It's part of your daily fare in the antebellum South. Um, German travelers, French travelers, English travelers, they all remark about this. And they are just bowled over that Americans, even the lowest, poorest Americans, eat more red meat than does any peasant in Europe or any working person in Europe. They have greater access to richer food than anyone does in Europe. And they can't get over that. How much uh, how much uh, hog flesh Americans consume even on a daily basis. So those are things to consider when we're thinking of America. We just have such a wealth in the common land. You don't even need to have much land of your own to have tremendous benefits from that. And this is a legacy of colonial Virginia. Obviously, a great many of us are familiar with Smithfield, which produces a lot of ham and bacon today. Smithfield from Smithfield, Virginia, in the Tidewater. That is part of the legacy of those early hogs brought to the Tidewater of Virginia that rooted around in the oak forest, eating those quantities of acorns and fattening up and becoming famous as a Virginia ham.
So I want to just bring this to a close, but one of the things I want to bring up is, you and I both have, you know, we've read extensively in kind of the neo-reactionary canon, right? And obviously within that, it's a profoundly anti-liberal tradition, but within that is this idea that America was this kind of flawed liberal propositional nation from the start, right? That this kind of monster was inevitable. And while it is certainly the case now, I wouldn't want to argue about it. One of the reasons I enjoy our conversations is because we can look at different times in American history where we did have sort of embodied traditions tied to a people that were expressed in a hierarchical way. And so I think that's why, specifically Virginia, but, other folkways as well are important to discuss.
Absolutely. We lose our way thinking of ourselves by trying to apply a theory to the experience. And we see that it doesn't match up. The experience itself, I think, is the better guide. And John Dickinson, one of the early debaters, participants in the War for Independence and the Declaration of Independence, eventually kind of a reluctant participant in some of that. But as soon as independence was declared, he devoted his whole fortune to the cause and went in and rallied a company and marched and joined the Continental Army. Really noble fellow, though a loyalist and a conservative, you might say, of Pennsylvania, actually. But John Dickinson, he said, reason may mislead us, and tradition should guide us. And I think that that is a good model for us to contemplate. We have a great many traditions around this gigantic continent that we refer to as a country. And we identify the ways that people have lived in these various places and the values that they identified about themselves and their experience there, or where they had come from before, and what they had brought with them to this new American place. I think that we can find a great many guides and positive examples that have proven to be durable. They've survived so many tests, these identities, um, these ways of living. And these are typically what people identify about America that's lovable, that's worth fighting for, worth preserving. And those are the most important things. It's not the theory we have about a Republican form of government that is what keeps us going in times of stress. Maybe that is an enthusiasm for the intellectuals, for those that spend a lot of time burning calories in their brains. But for most of us, it is the place and the people. It's these organic connections. It's these things that are close to home that spur us on, give us energy, give us motivation, and finally give us the courage. We really need to cultivate those aspects that encourage us to endure. Those things really do give us stamina. And many of these things are irrational. Many of these things cannot be accounted for. Reason cannot explain these sorts of things. It's experience that can explain these things.
So Bagby, we are at time. If people want to find more of your work, what's a good way for them to do that?
Of course, I have a handle on X. It is at Tallman Books. I run a small press. I've got lots of things in the works right now. I'm waiting on my friends, my graphic artist friends, to come up with some more covers for me, so that I can publish all the things that I've got ready to go. But I've got a bunch of books that are listed. They're pinned on my handle on X. So if you want to go and see my titles, go and look at my pinned tweets on my profile, and you can see links to buy them all wholesale. They are mostly books related to the antebellum South, and the Civil War and Reconstruction.
Well, again, I highly recommend all of the stuff you put on the internet. It's quite good. That will be linked down in the description. As far as my stuff, the Jay Burden Show is available on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you listen to podcasts. You can also check out Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching, the channel sponsor. Axios has been growing extraordinarily well, so you may see that sponsor bit on other podcasts. Again, a very good thing, as JD not only provides a good service, but make sure that money stays in our little economy here, right? Which I really do appreciate him for. And again, to everyone at home, keep your head up. The lie can't last forever. Good night.